here's where we get into the clarification of why we have both short-term and working memory in this box here. And so sometimes in different textbooks, you're going to see people using different terms. Our textbook is really good, and it actually clarifies the difference between short-term memory and working memory. Some books will hyphenate and call it short-term working memory. Some of them don't even like the term short-term memory, and some don't like the term working memory, but we're going to talk about them as sort of two separate identities, and I want you to just keep in mind that you might see them used either interchangeably or different sources will have different terminology that they prefer. So we've talked about our short-term memory, and we should be pretty good about that, but now we're going to get into working memory. And it's going to sound very, very similar to our short-term memory, but there's going to be a couple of very clear distinctions. So for our definitions, working memory, it's going to be a limited capacity system for storage and manipulation of information for complex tasks. So the limited capacity system sounds a lot like our short-term memory part, but now we've added this one term, manipulation. So when we were talking about short-term memory and just remembering a grocery list, you're not manipulating that list, you're just trying to remember that list by repeating it or holding on to it. Our working memory is going to focus very heavily on this manipulation. So you're going to hold information in your active memory and you're going to work on it. You're going to do something with it. So instead of just remembering a grocery list, maybe now we're going to start doing mental math. So if I wanted to be really mean, I could ask you, what is 193 plus 54? And I have already forgotten the first number that I gave you, so I can't tell you the answer. But if you're paying attention and you could use some working memory, maybe you could figure it out. And then we have some of our more familiar things. So our information in our working memory lasts about 20 seconds. It's going to be rapidly lost unless we're using it. And again, we can have a curve here where this is going to be our time delayed before recall and how many syllables you could correctly recall. And you see exactly the same kind of curve that we got with our short-term memory, but this time it's for working memory. And so if this hasn't completely cleared up the difference between short-term and working memory, I made a nice handy chart. So for a short-term memory, it's made up of a single component. There's just the one thing that we're using to try and hold on to that information. And its main concern is storing that information. That's just remembering your grocery list on the walk to the grocery store. Our working memory is going to be made up of multiple components. And we're going to spend the next couple of slides talking about each of those components, but because it's doing more, it's manipulating information, there's going to be more moving parts to this type of memory. And again, it's concerned with not just storage, but this time manipulating information, doing something with that information. And so if we're going to talk about all of those components, we're going to get very familiar with this diagram right here. And we're going to talk about the phonological loop, the Visuospatial Sketchpad, the Episodic Buffer, and our central executive. And of course, we'll talk about each of these individually. And we can see that they're interacting with our long-term memory. And what this just means is that we can start pulling things back out of our long-term memory. We can think of other things that we know that might help us manipulating the information we're trying to manipulate. And again, it'll all fall into place as we work through these. So starting with the central executive, this is our control center. This is the part that's in control of our working memory. This is the person that's sitting there with a hard hat who's barking out orders at everybody else. So our central executive is going to allocate data to our other components. It's going to decide which parts of our working memory the phonological loop or the episodic buffer or the Visuospatial Sketchpad. It's going to decide which of them needs information, and it's going to pass information between them. So this is where the work gets done, but it's going to make use of the other components to do that work. So it handles those cognitive tasks that we're conducting, things like mental math or problem solving, where we're manipulating information. So next we're moving on to that Visuospatial Sketchpad over here. So it's going to talk to and receive information from our central executive, but it can also pass information back and forth between long-term memory, stuff that we've stored away, things that we know in our brains. And our Visuospatial Sketchpad is our inner eye. You can probably imagine by looking at the words, visio meaning visual things, things that we can see, images, and spatial meaning that it's also going to be more of a three-dimensional spatial feel. So images and space, and a sketchpad just because that's where we're going to be working with some of that visual and spatial information. So it stores and processes visual and spatial information. Pretty cool. One of the most important ways we use this Visuospatial Sketchpad is to help us with navigation. So if somebody gives you directions, it's not going to be as simple as rehearsing them in your head with your short-term memory. You can't just repeat the directions. You have to make sense of those directions. If they say turn left at the big oak tree, you first have to find an oak tree, and then you have to remember to turn left. And you should then have a sense of what the direction left is from your long-term memory. Long-term memory could also help you identify what an oak tree looks like, if you have that information stored. So our Visuospatial Sketchpad helps us put together things in three-dimensional space. Next is our Phonological Loop. And this is going to deal with both spoken and written information. So if you hear information or if you see something written down, this phonological loop is how you're going to process that information. And we're going to separate our speech perception and speech production, which kind of makes sense from how our brains are laid out. We have Broca's area and Wernicke's area, so we can perceive and interpret speech separately from producing and making our own speech. And this phonological loop is super helpful to follow a conversation. So if you are listening to someone saying something, you can use this phonological loop to start assigning meaning, because you can hear those words, but maybe it doesn't mean anything until you pull meaning out of long-term memory. Start making some associations. If they're talking about something that you did the previous summer, you can think back and remember what you had done the previous summer. Help you follow that conversation. And last is our episodic buffer. And this is the newest addition to this working memory model. This is going to communicate with both long-term memory and the other components of working memory. So all of these arrows letting them communicate with each other. The episodic buffer can also, through that central executive, add on to our phonological loop or our Visuospatial Sketchpad. They're all going to work together through that central executive. So it's linking our visual, spatial, and verbal information specifically with time sequencing. So an episodic buffer, if you think of an episode, it's going to be a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. So it's assigning a time sequence, what happens first, what happens next, what happens later. It's giving that time stamp to all of the other things that you're thinking about. So on its own, it could help you, say, remember a story. If you're thinking about your favorite movie, maybe you remember how it starts and you remember the end of the movie. That's because the episodic buffer helps you attach that timestamp to those particular memories. And if we want to go back to our talking about directions, and I talked about directions in terms of that Visuospatial Sketchpad because you're using it to navigate in a three-dimensional space. But if you think about the whole scenario, somebody gives you directions. Somebody is telling you verbally, or maybe they sent you an email with a list of directions. To start making sense of that list, you're actually going to have to use that phonological loop. You're going to assign meaning to those words. Maybe then you're going to use that episodic buffer to remember which step do you follow first? Which step do you follow next? What do you follow last? And then the Visuospatial Sketchpad to start translating those directions at particular times in space into an action that you could perform when you've reached the oak tree at the corner. Which way do you now turn? And the central executive helps all of these communicate with each other so that we know what's being said. We can then assign time stamps to it, and we can act on those instructions in a three-dimensional space. So they're all going to work together for that working memory. And it lets you process and manipulate and work with all those different types of information.